Come light it up, I'm ready to go. Come light it up, come light it up, I'm ready to go. Come light it up.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have such a famous data meme expert live with us. In all seriousness, you've definitely established yourself as an amazing voice in the data space, and I'm super excited to hear what you have to say today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm super excited to have a conversation about data contracts.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself just to get started?
Sure. So my name's Chad Sanderson. I spent the last 3 years at a freight technology company called Convoy based out in Seattle. Prior to that, I worked on Microsoft's artificial intelligence platform team. Before that, I've been in big data for another 7 or 8 years, working at companies like Sephora, Oracle, and Subway. And then I lived a very different life where I was a journalist in Southeast Asia for around 5 or 6 years.
You've lived many lives.
I have. Not all of them good.
Sure. Before we jump into discussing data contracts, I think it is important for us to talk about the bigger picture of data quality and the issues there. So can you talk about your experiences with unreliable data and how that's affected you in your previous work or your work today?
Sure. So when I was running the data platform team over at Convoy, data quality was one of our biggest issues. Convoy is a very heavily machine learning and AI-driven business. We were a marketplace that sat between a shipper on one side and a carrier on another side, and we used machine learning to optimize shipment routes. So if our data quality was poor, as in we suffered from the garbage in, garbage out problem, we would make really bad predictions from our models, and that included everything from an on-time sort of delivery model that predicted whether or not the shipments were going to arrive within their scheduled windows, to a pricing model that actually determined whether or not we made money bidding on any particular shipment. There were many situations in my career where a lack of data quality resulted in measurably worse business outcomes. One example, I remember when we were working on our pricing model, something as simple as a dropped column from a production table upstream resulted in really significant model outages.
I have chills.
People were scrambling, and I think we lost maybe $1 million over a couple days due to those issues. And there was really no sort of constraints or preventative mechanisms in place to catch those issues before they happened.
That sounds awful.
It was awful.
So I think everyone in data has faced some sort of issue or sentiment like that, you know, of that bad ROI or a change causing some issue. Obviously, data contracts try to enforce accountability to fix that. So can we start by just talking about, you know, what a data contract is and how it can address that issue of data quality?
Absolutely. So a data contract is an API-esque agreement between some data producer and a data consumer about what the data is. What is the shape of the data? What is its schema? What are the values, the semantics, and the SLAs? It's really that simple. The question is, how do you actually create that contract? Where is it authored? And how is it enforced? And this is where I have some very strong opinions on the right way to do that and how to make that system programmatic and scalable.
Absolutely. So my mind is immediately jumping to the relationship between the data producer and the data consumer. Like you mentioned, the end goal is ideally to increase collaboration, right, between your producers and your consumers. So what does that relationship look like? Is it who plays what role and who drives that relationship? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, here's one way of thinking about it. Oftentimes when we talk about data quality, the responsibility is put solely onto the data consumer, whether it's the data engineer or the data scientist or the data analyst. We have some really, really high expectations of our data professionals to be able to monitor the data, figure out if something broke, debug it, root cause it, and then potentially solve it. What I have seen, especially at Convoy and even at Microsoft, is that a non-trivial number of data quality failures happen upstream. So that means a producer or a software engineer or someone else who might own an API that has nothing to do with the way we use data for analytics and machine learning. This is obviously incredibly problematic because those software engineers or database owners are not thinking about the data when they're building out their transactional systems, right? They're doing that for some application-centric reason. They want to run their app as best they possibly can. And if the data fails along the way, well, it's not really their problem. Nobody asked them to do this job. And so what the data contract does is its goal to drive decentralized accountability between the data producer and data consumer. It's making the whole organization more responsible for the quality of the data instead of pinning all of it on one central team, which oftentimes is the data engineers that don't have the ability to resolve that problem themselves.
Avoid the kicking it down the line problem, if
Exactly.
you will. Yes. So I'm thinking about to my close relationship I had with the data producer where it was a streaming pipeline and I was a data consumer. I'm totally with you that the tight collaboration helps make it better. We worked very closely with each other. But one thing that I'm thinking of in my head is that they produced for multiple teams. So how do you kind of uphold that relationship where you have one producer to many consumers? Like, what are the logistics involved in that sort of, work balance?
Totally. So the best way to think about data contracts is that they are APIs for data, right? It's a specification of here's the data I need, here's the input, here's the output, here's some documentation around it, and some programmatic way of authoring and enforcing that contract. And in the same way, a producer creates a API which is used by multiple consumers in any other service level context. You would do the same thing for a data contract. A data contract might be initiated by a consumer that has a very specific use case. For example, if I'm building out a machine learning model, maybe a pricing model, and I need a data contract to support that pipeline, I might be the person who goes to the software engineer that owns those upstream systems and tells them exactly what constraints I need on the data, and maybe or maybe not they acquiesce to my request. But as other requests come in, it's up to that data producer to decide the best way to construct their API to solve the problem for all the consumers that they have. So this is an iterative object that evolves over time that is a responsibility of the data producer to treat it like an abstraction.
Sure. So a one-to-many relationship, right? Pretty
Exactly.
much. And then from there, the consumers will do with what they need to then build off of that API that they've created.
Correct. And if you have a consumer that maybe needs something added to the contract over time because there's a real business use case for it, then there should be a system of having that conversation with the producer. Really, the goal of the contract is to have great conversations. And just to tie it back one more time, increase the collaboration between these two data producer and data consumers that oftentimes are not really working that well together.
So what if you have two data consumers that one needs a column and one doesn't? Do you add it to the to the contract and then later figure it out downstream, or how would you work that out?
So if you have one consumer that needs a column and one consumer that doesn't, you would treat it in the same way as an API. In the same way as an API, you might have someone that needs part of that API, but not all of it. They're only accessing certain pieces. You kind of treat it like that. If you can establish a concrete use case for that column that needs to be under contract, that if it's ever violated, it results in business value, decreasing in some meaningful way, then it's up the responsibility of the producer to decide whether or not they should be vending this.
Oh, so basically the producers are getting a little bit more ownership too in their whole process as opposed to just being told what to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't like thinking about contracts as a wall where we consumers say, hey, here's what we need. You can never violate this ever, or else there'll be problems and we'll shake our fingers at you. Where in reality, it's supposed to be a feedback loop, right? It's a conversation where there's a request, we talk about that request, the software engineer understands how changes they make could impact their consumers, and software engineers, just like anybody else, want to provide scalable, maintainable systems, and that conversation ideally results in an evolution of the contract over time.
Awesome. So I'm thinking about my ETL background, and there were situations where I felt like I was simultaneously a data producer and a data consumer at the same time, through that pipeline origin, and people basically, I was in the middle of that whole situation. Can we talk about if that fits into data contracts at all, or if that's, we were doing it wrong, or what do you think about that?
So you absolutely were a producer. I think of a producer as anyone that is generating some new novel transformation of the data. So if you're very, very upstream and you own a database and you're the source of this data, obviously you're a producer. If you're an analyst that sits a little bit downstream and you're creating a meaningful aggregation, let's say like margin, and you're vending that out to various other consumers, you're also a producer. So if you imagine your entire data pipeline for some meaningful data object, let's call it a data product. I know that that's going to come into play later.
Yep.
Every transformation step in that pipeline, in my opinion, would require a contract. And that contract would have a different mechanism of definition and enforcement depending on the technologies in which it's implemented.
So I think my next thought goes back to the granularity, right? Because if you're saying that you can have a producer and a consumer at every single level, where do we cut it off? You know, like, could we even do, if we built a visualization and we sent it to someone, are we a producer and they're a consumer? Or is that getting a little too in the weeds? And we should know that it's code-based and has to be checked with the enforcements.
I think that is the natural implication of what I'm saying, is that anytime there is a handoff of data from one team to another team, the implication is that a contract should probably exist. Now, I think that there is some level of maturity that needs to exist at any company before you can enforce contracts meaningfully at every part of the pipeline. So teams need to take baby steps. But I think as that maturity grows over time, the expectation would be even someone who is a business savvy, maybe non-technical consumer should be able to define business-centric requests of their data and have those implemented in the form of contracts.
That would really probably help a lot of our lives and make it a lot easier from that communication, you know? So I know we touched on it, but I'd be remiss to not dive into that data products notion and talk about how data contracts fit into that. So can we kind of tie in how those concepts fit together?
Sure. So the way that I think about data products is it's really any data asset that requires a set of requirements supported by an engineering team. And that's how we define products everywhere else, right? If I'm built, whether it's a front-end product or a back-end product or an API, there's a set of requirements and there's an engineering team that has to support those. So in the same way that there are products for software, I think that there's products for data. And so in scenarios where an engineering team has to be in the loop to support a data product, you need a data contract, which acts as the API. It's just an API specifically designed for data. So, and this is something I want to make very, very clear because sometimes people get confused about data contracts. There's a lot of, stuff floating around in the ether. Not every single pipeline needs a data contract. There's a lot of things in our data ecosystem that don't require the level of ownership, of trustworthiness, of accuracy that a data contract ensures, because there is a cost to implementing these, as I've already said, right? So if you've got a really important machine learning model, for example, and that generates tens of millions of dollars in your business, you need to treat that as part of your product, and that means treating the data pipeline as a part of your product as well, which requires an API. That's just one example.
So I think I've heard you say before there has to be, an ROI implication, right, for implementing a data contract. At what point, where's that limit for you? How do you make that decision of, this one's over the line? Is it a spectrum and you just kind of pick and choose and learn as you go based off of your business? Or is it something that you can, maybe set a preset ROI limit and anything above that at a company? Or can you do both?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really depends on the business, which is kind of a cop-out answer. In my mind, it is a spectrum, certainly. Yeah. And if you imagine on one end of the spectrum, we have more of prototyping, ad hoc-centric use cases, things that don't necessarily require high data quality, directional data is completely acceptable. And then on the other end of that spectrum, we have requirements for extremely high data quality where directionality is not acceptable at all, right? So examples might be an ad hoc query probably doesn't need an extraordinarily high level of data quality. We're trying to learn more about our business. We're trying to answer some off-the-cuff business question, but we don't need to have the level of rigor that comes along with a contract. Whereas, let's say that we have a data pipeline that is audited by the United States government. That is going to require a different level of accountability and enforcement and safety. And all in between are different types of data products. So an artificial intelligence system is probably going to lean a little bit more towards the right. A dashboard that a product manager asks you to put together for a new feature, that's probably going to lean a little bit more on the left.
And at some point, I'm assuming, since it is a spectrum, and we've talked about those ad hoc requests, when those get promoted, you can then enforce those contracts later and build onto it. Exactly.
In my mind, there's really two states of anyone's data infrastructure / data ecosystem. There's a prototyping universe and there's a production universe. One of the problems I think we've made as an industry is that we've combined both of these two things together, and that's what creates all this spaghetti SQL that inevitably powers some of our most meaningful data pipelines and artificial intelligence products. In reality, we need to separate those two worlds. We need to have one universe where it's okay to move quickly. It's okay to replicate data from production systems and not have extremely clear context and semantic constraints and requirements. We need to be able to build data models rapidly and plug them into visualization systems. But exactly as you said, once you decide to graduate that data asset into a production grade system that is delivering true value to the business, now you need to treat it like a data product, and that requires a contract.
You need to trademark spaghetti SQL.
I should.
I think, would you separate those two by environment, or is that one way of doing it, or is it just another way of just, understanding that data quality goes along with those, higher costs, or is that something that people just know because you have good documentation?
Yeah, I think it's either or and also and.
Sure.
I think there's an ideal world that we're talking about where everything valuable is under contract, every producer knows what their data responsibilities are, no constraints are violated, and if they are, there's very clear change communication. That's awesome, and that's sort of the utopian vision that sits sort of way over there in the background for most companies. Where most people are today is there's very little ownership, certainly almost no ownership on the producer side. Both of these environments that I talked about are very tightly coupled to each other, and data quality issues abound. And I think the only real way of doing this is to gradually start to decouple those systems over time. And that begins by taking a high-value use case and just going really deep on that and saying, all right, I've got a pricing model, I've got a pipeline that might be audited by the government, whatever your situation might be, let's just figure out ownership for this one thing and move that over to our new production grade environment, whatever that is. It doesn't need to be a literal environment change. It could be a figurative change. And maybe as the business starts to do this more and more and more, we begin to have more standards and greater degrees of separation and things like that.
I know we've touched on this before, but can we go back to the trade-offs of implementing data contracts? What are, not the downsides, but what is the work that has to be done for your infrastructure, or what does it cost you to actually implement data contracts within your organization?
Totally. So when you think about data contracts, the best way to frame it is there's really 4 or 5 different mechanisms of implementation, or things that you should think about running checks on in the preventative way. The first is the schema. Schemas are foundational. If you've listened to some of the discourse about data contracts online, you might think contracts are only about schema. In reality, they're a part of the contract. There needs to be some mechanism of defining that schema, storing the schema, and then being able to perform checks against that schema at critical moments, like during the CI/CD phase.
Yes.
The next piece is values, right? We care about the data itself. The reason that data APIs, data contracts are different from regular APIs is that we don't just care about the schema, we also care about what's coming over the pipe to us. If I have a property called tax identification number that is 10 characters, I need that to be 10 characters long. If I get a number that's 15 characters long, this is obviously a big problem, right? Or if I have a customer identifier that always has to be 8 characters, or it always has to be 2 words, and it's 3 words, or it's 1 word, then that's going to be a big problem for my pipeline. So you need to have some way of defining the constraints around values and enforcing those values. There's a bunch of different places that you can do that. You can enforce values in the stream processing layer in CDC as each row comes over the pipe, or you could do it in batch all at once. You also need to care about the semantics of the data, which I think about as relationships from one data object to another data object. So maybe, I'm thinking in the context of Convoy, which is a shipment logistics business. If the state of a shipment at any point in time is canceled or delivered or off hold, then that needs to be reflected on the state of a shipper at any point in time. There has to be a relationship between those 2 entities. Those are also checks that can run in a stream processing layer or also in batch. And then finally, you have distributions that might be meaningful to you. For example, I might always expect that one particular column is a normal distribution. And if it's ever a bimodal distribution, that's a real issue. That indicates that there is some production thing happening that we probably need to address.
Yes.
So each one of those types of checks needs to be implemented, and our goal is to make those checks as close to the source system, as far left as we can possibly shift them, so we can push as much of the accountability as we can back onto the producer.
Yes. So as the, data contracts guru, if you say that you've heard about data contracts for the first time today, my biggest, thought that comes with that is, how would I get my business to justify putting in the infrastructure for this?
Right.
So would that be something like, oh, we'll start with a contract that's more verbal and just started getting into the process and then build my way up as I see, ROI on my data pipelines? Or what would you say to those people?
Well, it really depends on where the needs are at the time. So if you're the type of company, for example, that's small, and maybe you don't have a lot of data, but you know that this is going to be an issue which manifests in the future, it could probably be enough to just have really great conversations with those producer teams. Anytime there's a change, you want to be in a room. You can establish that as a best practice, and that's something that you can probably facilitate and it will actually work, for the first 2 or 3 years. But at some point, you do hit a scale limitation. We all hit a scale limitation as data people. Generally speaking, there's a much larger number of software engineers that are hired at any business relative to the data engineers and data team members that are hired. And so you're just not going to be able to multiply yourself enough times to be in all of those conversations. And that is generally when a programmatic solution probably starts making a little bit more sense. The other place that it starts making more sense to justify that investment is when you have a data product that is actively breaking. So there's one company that I've talked to which will go unnamed, and they're a fintech company. And they do a lot of really interesting financial computations and data modeling and machine learning and usage-based pricing, all within their data ecosystem. Their data engineers and analysts and data scientists are responsible for building this. Their production systems are changing all the time.
Yeah.
And because they're changing all the time and new features are being added, these pipelines are constantly being broken. There's constantly bad values and bad data coming in. People are constantly writing features, and this becomes, or filters, and this becomes a really, really big deal in machine learning especially. When I was at Convoy, some of our most critical models, like 20 to 30% of the data, we had to throw away because it was null. Now, if you're throwing away 1%, 2% of the data, maybe it's not that bad. But if you're throwing away in the double digits, now your model is making predictions that are out of line with the real world. And this is starting to have potentially a very, very real impact on your business. And that's where you have to do an ROI conversation. Sure. And you say, well, there is going to be a cost to build some of this infrastructure. Luckily, most of it is using open source tooling that already exists out in the world. A lot of companies are already starting to make that investment in these types of open source tools to solve exactly the type of problems that I'm talking about. And you implement a contract or a production grade pipeline for those use cases where the business is either losing or radically needs to gain money. And that's when you can go to your leadership and say, hey, look, I stopped this critical system from breaking down. Here's how much money we are saving by month, by year on average, and that can justify future investments.
So while data contracts at the beginning may cost you money because you have to build the infrastructure and all that work, they're also a cost-saving tool, you would say?
I think it can be
Sure.
a cost-saving tool and also a money-making tool. If you've got a machine learning model that is being powered by much better data, there's a really good likelihood that that machine learning model is going to deliver greater value than it could have. Andrew Ng talks about this a lot. We've sort of moved on from the period where data scientists were focused exclusively on optimizing models. Now we're getting into the phase of optimizing data as the primary mechanism of improving those artificial intelligence systems. And one of the best ways of doing that is fixing data quality issues at the source.
Yes. So talking more about data quality, what I immediately think of is like SLA checks or, variance checks or, just simple row counts or anything. How do you document that part of the data contract? How do you technically put that in there? Is that just as, because I immediately can see the schema enforcement, and you've written some awesome articles about how to implement that, but where does that go in the contract?
Yeah, so sneak peek, I am writing an article about this. It's the next one that's coming, so if you're not following me on Substack, you should probably do that, it's free. Little plug there. But yeah, the way that we did this was all in YAML. So we had a YAML file. That YAML file was stored in a central Git repository. Whoever was creating the contract would write out their constraints, and they would essentially point to the place where the contract needed to be enforced. So there was one level of enforcement that ran in the application code itself. So we would do value checks there that would pull from those YAML-based constraints. There was a set of checks that ran in a stream processing layer. So we were using Flink as the data was flowing from via Kafka from our production system into our data lake. We would use Flink SQL, run a check on the data as it moved between one system and another. And if that contract was violated according to those constraints, we would push that data into a DLQ and alert an on-call engineer and say, hey, there's been a problem. The other really great thing about that is that it's super tactile.
Sure.
So as soon as a change is made, very, very quickly, your upstream producers know, exactly when something's broken and how to debug it. You can also implement these types of tests in great tools like dbt, Monte Carlo, Airflow, and you can do all that in the warehouse. Of course, there is a limitation in that you're not truly preventing the data from entering the system at that point, but you can still detect it and you can initiate rollbacks to previous versions if there's major issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that sometimes batch seems a little bit messier because it's more reactive versus proactive. Am I making the right assumption there?
I would say that's definitely the right assumption. Really at any level, as long as you're using some sort of CLI-based tool, like dbt is a great example, which I'm a huge fan of, you can still register your schema and then perform backwards incompatibility checks during the build phase, and you can block inconsistency, backwards incompatible schema changes from happening. But when it comes to other changes, like you've said, and you're trying to catch those in batch, really the best thing that you can do is arm yourself with good constraints, be able to detect those potentially before the data moves from one part of the pipeline into another part, and then try to either roll it back or alert the team that's going to be impacted that like, hey, a change is coming, here's exactly what's coming, and really communicate how these changes are affecting people downstream.
So I'm immediately kind of sweating thinking about like, oh, well, I implement a data contract for batch, but it's really someone else's data upstream that's wrong.
Exactly.
What do you do there?
Yeah, and this is why I spend most of my time talking about the data contracts starting from the production systems, moving downstream, and for exactly the reasons that you say.
Right.
If you don't have that upstream ownership first, it's going to be so difficult as like a data scientist or an analyst or a data engineer to take true accountability. And to be frank, this is why we don't really have true accountability today, right? Yeah. This is why it's so hard to go to a team and say, hey, I need you to take ownership of this data set and fix data quality issues. Yeah. Because in the same way that you would be sweating about not having a contract with the upstream team, everyone else is sweating thinking, well, if something changes and I get bad data, that means I'm on the hook now and I didn't cause this. So this is why I think the whole industry really requires a pretty significant culture change to shift left. I truly don't believe data quality is a solvable problem without including the producers in the loop.
Especially right now. I mean, why do you think our data culture is so, averse to software engineering? Like, why are we like that? How did we get here?
It's a good question. I think there's a few potential explanations for it. One is the modern data stack is really rooted in speed, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole promise. Okay, we can decouple from, computation and storage. We can, add as much data as we possibly want from all these different places out in the world, and this is amazing. And we're going to replicate that into our data environment, wherever that is. And then we're going to model it, and then we're going to answer interesting questions about it. So the fact that most data infrastructure today is fundamentally built for speed, well, that doesn't really go hand in hand with engineering best practices, right?
Or data quality.
Or data quality, or data quality, or data quality in general. And I would say there's another big issue, which is that really is no one's fault, but it has to do with the trajectory of data at most companies.
Sure.
Right? When most companies start thinking about data is usually as a support function to a product.
After they have data.
Yeah, right. After
Yeah.
they have data, right? This is mainly to support product teams or sales and marketing teams. We're trying to grow the business quickly. We're trying to, see how many people are churning, how many people are using features, and to answer those questions, your data only really needs to be directionally correct.
Right.
Right?
Right.
If I want to understand, well, how many people are clicking on a new feature I shipped, do I really need to be accurate down to the click? No, I just need to know in general what's happening. But as the company starts to mature, you start to see more of these data product-centric use cases emerge. And if our entire infrastructure is built for speed and being directional, well, now we're being asked to shift towards quality and stability, which is more of this engineering-based workflow. And I think this is why a lot of people pull back.
Right. It's directional until it gets sent to the CEO. And then the ROI conversation comes in because it's like, oh, well, this is going to matter. So we need to actually, pay attention to it and have data quality on it. And then you can say, well, let's implement data contracts and then move forward and all of the things. So Chad, I just want to thank you again so much for being here with us. And where can we find you? How do we join Data Quality Camp?
Well, you can join Data Quality Camp right now because I have a handy dandy link. That's dataquality.camp/Slack. It's free to join. Right now we have about 3,500 members. And
I'm
we're
in
talking. Monica is there.
I'm there. Joe's there.
Joe
Reese
is there. Lots of people, lots of our friends are sitting off camera right now. And we talk about things like data contracts and generally implementing data quality at scale. So I definitely recommend joining that. If you want to reach out to me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in Chad Sanderson or Chad J. Sanderson, I think. I'm super, super accessible. So any questions that you have about data contracts, either on the implementation side, on how you initiate cultural change, I'm more than happy to answer those.
You also have so many awesome articles about it that you've written, like you said, on your Substack, and those are a really good resource first if you want to, learn there before asking questions.
Totally, and that is dataproducts.substack.com.
Nice, nice. Okay, well, thank you so much again for being here.